Hello, I'm Bob Heilbrunner, and this is a recording of the talk I gave for class 6 of my course called Belonging to Ourselves, Each Other, and the Planet. And the topic of that class is the evolution of our human instinctual heritage of that underlies our ability to do pro-social behavior and to belong on the planet. Talking about our instinctual structure to belong and to do pro-social behaviors that promote community is a contradiction to what we in this class have been calling the narcissistic paradigm, which basically assumes that human nature is purely, not only partly, but fundamentally selfish, self-interest, and that we have evolved on the basis of a fight for survival, and that the survivors pass on those genes. And so the genes are that we have are the genes of the winners of the competition for survival, including between human beings, and therefore the winners genes. And that notion has been popularized in the simplistic view of the selfish gene, which implies that if we have pro-social behavior, it is basically in spite of our biological nature, and that it it's a result of a victory of civilization over nature. Now that's contradicted by a number of very obvious things, one of which is simply the crimes of civilization, the genocide, the wars, the colonialism, empire, the extinctions, and the environmental destruction that have been done by civilization. So the idea that civilization is necessarily a progress of goodness against our naturally selfish and aggressive behavior is pretty suspect. There's another problem with that, which is that if we say that we are creating civilization against nature, it's first of all pretty clearly, whenever you're trying to fight against nature, you're signing up for a losing battle, which we need to learn as a species, and in which we are learning. And secondly, if you're fighting for a hopeless losing battle against a greater force like nature, it tends to help you think that you are entitled to use more and more extreme and brutal means in that fight. So one, the idea that civilization is a victory of pro-social caring behavior against selfish and aggressive and violent behavior is contradicted by the fact that that's not how it looks if you look at the history of civilization. It's also contradicted by all of the affiliative and bonding and nurturing and empathic and self-sacrificing behaviors that we've talked about when we talked about the brain, the mammalian part of the brain, and both the mammalian part of the brain and all the instincts for bonding and love, and the integrating part of the brain, which is the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, whose job it is to look out for the interests of the whole. So the narcissistic view of evolution is sort of popularized with the notion of survival of the fittest. That would be okay if you have a sophisticated definition of fittest, but if by fittest, you mean the biggest, baddest, meanest, and most self-centered, most selfish part. If that's what, and that's sort of what the popular version implies of survival of the fittest. And therefore, if we want to survive, we need to be as self-centered and as selfish and aggressive as we can, as individuals and as a species. And we talked about that being contradicted by the view that I've called the survival of that which fits in. Not the survival of the fittest in a simplistic sense, but the survival of that which fits in. Which is to say, of that which finds itself a niche within the web of life, where it depends upon and is nurtured by life, and where it contributes to and becomes a co-creator of an ongoing co-creator of the web of life. I'm going to talk about an experience I had that there's no new ideas in this, but that where I got it on a level, on a clearer level than before. I live in the forest, and my house is in a clearing in the forest, and behind my house is a deck, and around that deck there's a dense web of St. John's wort, which is a bushy, this type of thing is a bushy green covering, and it puts up these amazingly golden, rich butter colored golden blossoms, and these blossoms have a bush of stamens and stuff of pollen holding things. It's almost like it's like a soft brush, they're just juicy looking. And I'm sitting there, and I noticed that almost all of these blossoms have a black and golden bumblebee that's trampolining on these blossoms, and the bumblebees are just in obvious ecstasy. I mean, they're covered with pollen, and they're just bouncing up and down, and they're getting the nectars why they're there for, but in the process getting covered with pollen, which they're going to take to the next plant. But they're just having a great time. And the image I got was that the St. John's wort was essentially saying, this is me. This is what I got. This is what I got to offer. Anyone interested? Any takers? And the bumblebees are going, yeah, we like this. This is good shit. Thank you. And using it. And because the bumblebees are accepting the offer, the St. John's wort gets to propagate, because the bumblebees take the pollen and pollinate, do the pollination that's necessary for the survival of St. John's wort. And in the St. John's wort, so because its offer has been accepted, and the bee's offer is accepted, of going around and helping the St. John's wort propagate. So what I got from that was that everything in nature is sort of saying, here I am. This is me. Anyone interested? In those whose offer gets accepted, those whose offer is of value to something in the web of life, have a niche in the web of life and continue to be an ongoing part of the web of life. And those whose offer is not accepted fall through the cracks and do not continue to exist. So everything that exists is something that has woven itself into the web of life because it has been of some use to something else in the web of life, and because it has known how to make use of the nourishment from the web of life. Only those with the instinctual structure to weave themselves into the mutual dependencies and accommodations that make up the web of life survive to become participants in the web of life and ongoing co-creators of the web of life. Now, we've seen how the narcissistic, that doesn't mean that there isn't competition as well, right? But to say that the best way in the fundamental principle of evolution and of nature is competition is very limited and one-sided. So we've seen how the narcissistic worldview supports entrenched power by promoting a hierarchical view of the world in which the powerful have earned their power by winning the evolutionary contest for dominance, because evolution is seen as a contest for dominance. And that justifies both the individuals who've succeeded, the classes that have succeeded, the races that have succeeded, and the civilizations that have succeeded. So that view is supportive of entrenched power on all those levels, and it justifies exploitation and conquest and genocide of the lesser successful individuals, species, and civilizations. And one other important or related important part of the narcissistic view is that it denies the idea that there's a general or a social interest of society as a whole to which individual interests need to be subordinated and accountable. That it's not just the interest of those who dominate the hierarchy, but it's the interest of the whole, and that the individual interests need to be subordinated and accountable to the interest of the whole, which is a basically radical and democratic, if you want to call it that, idea, and an anti dangerous idea from the point of view of entrenched power. Now, how does that view, that narcissistic view, get reflected in materialist science and a narrow, materialistically scientific view or way of trying to understand the world? And it takes place on, I want to say, in scientific, certain materialist, not in, if by science you mean an effort to continue to understand the world by trying things out, and an ongoing theory of theories and assumptions, and testing of those assumptions and discarding those that don't seem to work and developing new ones. That's real science. That's a living intellectual and progressive intellectual process. But insofar as science is narrowly materialistic, so I'm not talking about real science, because real science involves philosophy and worldviews and big stuff. But I'm saying in a narrow materialistic view of science, which is the foundation of our materialistic view of evolution, the unconscious assumptions of our culture appear in the form of atomism. Atomism is the largely unconscious assumption of how the world works that underlies a materialistic view, and that underlies the view of evolution as a struggle of individual units against each other. So atomism is the view that the world is best understood by breaking it down to its parts, breaking it down to its atoms. If you break things down to its parts, that's how you understand something. Take it apart. And then tracking how the parts cause the whole. Break it down to the parts, understand the parts. Now you understand how the parts make the whole. Now you really understand something. So for instance, breaking down biological processes to chemicals and chemical reactions. Now and you notice that's a unidirectional view. The parts cause the whole. A unidirectional theory of causality in which the parts make up the whole. Now that's a very powerful, useful tool. For instance, just breaking down and understanding the chemical properties of life has yielded chemical interventions that save lives. Breaking it down, breaking processes down to genes has allowed us to do genetic interventions that are, so it's a tremendously powerful and useful tool. Break atom is. So what's the problem, right? The problem is that wholes have qualities that are not qualities of the parts. A whole is not equal to the sum of the parts. Now, one of the places that's most obvious is if you've been with someone who is dying and dies. And at the moment of death, the parts are all still there. What's gone is life, but what's gone is the relationship between the parts that makes it a living organism. So life is not an object, but it's an ongoing relationship. The whole is a relationship of the parts that has qualities not possessed of the whole. Now, you can look at that and say, duh, right? You kind of want to say duh. So it's that say organic molecules have qualities that aren't possessed of atoms, that cells have qualities that aren't possessed of organic molecules, that tissue has qualities not possessed of cells, that organs have qualities not possessed by tissues alone, that organisms have qualities not possessed of organs, right? The human being with all its organs has qualities that a liver by itself doesn't have. A flock of birds or a herd has qualities that an individual bird or doesn't have. Families have qualities that an individual doesn't have. A community has qualities that its parts do not have. So again, one of the ways where you can see where an scientific orthodoxy, intellectual orthodoxy is handcuffing thought is when science goes to enormous scientists who are trying to look at the thing that's kind of obvious, like what I just said, have to work really hard because they're fighting against the stream, because they're fighting against an unconscious they're fighting against unconscious assumptions, which are by being unconscious, are sort of unquestioned and assumed. So there's been a lot of work by what I'll call progressive scientists on the concept of emergence. So we have atomism, and the contradiction or the growing out of atomism is the breaking beyond the bounds of atomism is the concept of emergence. That's the scientific word for what we just talked about. So if life is a progressive coming together of parts to form new wholes, then life is a creative process in which new wholes emerge, which have new qualities that never existed before, and that cannot be reduced to the parts, but is explained by a new wholeness that emerges from the relationship of the parts. And that's whether you're talking about entity, any kind of entity, whether you're talking about beings and species, and whether you're talking about systems like ecosystems. I'm going to talk about another personal experience. I talked about this in class. There's a reduced version of that, but I had a stroke, what they call a TIA, which is to say a stroke that doesn't leave any permanent damage. And this was, I don't know, 5 years ago or so. And when I awoke from 4 hours of being unconscious, I awoke with an image. This is not some out of body something experience. This was a conscious awoke to this image. And the image was that right here in my solar plexus was the center of the world. Now it's a center, but my experience was this is the center of my world, the world. And that from that center, and then I had, the Da Vinci figure of the man with his arms spread and his legs spread, that this was my center. And from that center, every part of me was reaching out to everything else. And then I had I forget the word for that, this set of images, of dendritic images at every, holographic images, that was the word I was looking for, holographic images at every size, from the fibers within a cell that hold it together, to neural patterns, to trees, to tree branches, to leaves, to deltas, to river systems, to you name it. You could just levels that have this dendritic pattern, and that those are basically about that everything that exists has to, one, be itself, that is to have a center, and everything that exists has to be webbed into everything else. So the image was everything has a center, and all of those centers are reaching out for everything else. And the conceit from that was, the intellectual conceit from that was, that's the basic architecture of the universe. Basic architecture of the universe is things being themselves and reaching out for everything else and connected to everything else. And of course, there's nothing unique about my center. Everything that exists is its center. That's, which, by the way, takes us back. Ram Dass said, it's not crazy to think you're God unless you forget that everyone else is God too. Or Joseph Campbell, when he talked about black elk, he says, black elk says, Harney Peak is the center of the world, which, because it was the center of his tribal Sioux world. And so is every place else. And so is every place else, Campbell says. That's what shows that black elk was a universal shaman, not just a tribal shaman. So, but that's sort of, we've been talking about belonging. Belonging is, one, being yourself, and two, being connected to everything else. And that's how the universe is built. So, you have to understand the power of the unconscious power of the dominant, the atomistic view. You have to get that before you understand why evolutionary scientists have been, on some level, dumbfounded by the idea of altruism. How could there be altruism if the only way, how can there be pro-social behavior? How would it ever emerge? How would it ever be successful, be a successful adaptation and therefore carried on? Because if it's behavior that sacrifices the individual interest for survival, why would that? How would that be passed on, and why would that be evolutionarily adaptive, meaning useful? And so there's a whole thing of the prisoner's dilemma, which I'm not going to go into, but there's this dilemma in which all these scientists are going, how could this be? And it's an interesting example because it sort of shows how your unconscious assumptions define the questions you ask, and the questions you ask then define the experiments you take. So built into the whole experiment is the assumption, is setting up an experiment in which the experiment is basically there's two criminals that have been caught, and if both of them shut up, they go scot-free. If one of them rats the other one out, he's fine, or he has a smaller punishment, and the one that's ratted out spends the rest of their life in jail. Or oops. The point is, it's in your, if you trust the other guy, if you trust each other, you get a better result for both of you. If you don't trust each other, it's better to be the one that cheats. So that breaks the trust. So, and then they do mind games, essentially, game theory stuff about how in that situation would pro-social behavior evolve, and they come to some conclusion, which is the tit for tat, they call it. But again, that's a whole discussion I'm not getting into in detail. But the thing to notice is they are trying to understand altruism, and they've set up an experiment. It's only two people in this experiment where the interests of the two are in opposition. The fundamental interests are in opposition. And so if you try to understand altruism and you set up an experiment in which you've chosen a situation in which the interests are in opposition, they're essentially saying that the situation in which interests are in fundamental opposition is the representative example to understand the human behavior that's evolved. Anyway, when you see so the hidden assumption in all of that is that evolution is powered by individual survival. Individual survival. The atomistic view of evolution says that the parts make up the whole. And if evolution favors selfish behavior, how did we get pro-social behavior that benefits the whole? Why wouldn't the person who sacrifices themselves not pass on their genes, and therefore that be a non-adaptive behavior? So now we're back to the atomistic causality, because the causality between the parts and the whole is not unidirectional. It's not linear. It's circular. So it's true that the individual, the skills of individuals, for instance, being a good hunter or being a good weaver, those skills contribute to the tribe. And so the better hunting skills that individuals have, that is a contribution to the survival of the tribe, and they'll do better because they are successful hunters. But if the tribe expels those excellent hunters who are selfish and eat all the meat themselves and won't share it, if it expels those highly skilled individuals who can't be gotten to behave in a way that's in the interest of the tribe, if it leaves them on the ice floe, then the super selfish behavior is not passed on and is not adaptive. So behaviors that are adaptive for the tribe are adaptive for the individual, because those individuals who don't behave in a way that's good, that works for the tribe, don't get to pass on their genes. This is the same for a forest. A forest is a community of interdependent beings, and a being, whether it's a woodpecker or an insect or an invasive weed, that kills the forest eventually kills the conditions of its own existence. And we can think a lot of examples of that. I mean, the human relationship to the environment is the obvious challenge that we're facing now. So there is species evolution. Now, Darwin believed in species evolution, but that idea got dropped and got considered romantic and old-fashioned when under the aegis of the selfish gene evolution, of the atomistic view. But behavior that supports the survival of the species are adaptive because the survival of the individual depends on the species. On a larger scale, behaviors that are adaptive for an ecosystem are adaptive for the species that depend on the ecosystem, as we are learning. So evolutionary biologists have been sort of excavating pro-social behavior and the genetic foundation for pro-social behavior. And one example of that is a book called Blueprint, The Evolution of a Good Society, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society by Nicholas Christakis, Christakis. And he says that unlike a transactional model of human behavior, where we say human behavior is essentially a rational calculation, and that is a rational calculation, don't understand the evolutionary foundation of good behavior. And so the most, people know about Hobbes, right? Life in nature is nasty, brutish, and short, right? And so the assumption, that's the narcissistic assumption, is that we're all basically selfish and just, fighting for ourselves. And we would love to just murder, plunder, and rape. But we don't like to be murdered and plundered and raped. So we make a deal. Civilization is a deal. I say, you know what? Much as I'd like to murder, plunder, and rape you, let's make a deal. You don't plunder, murder, and rape me, and I won't plunder, murder, rape you. And now we have a civilization, a contract that's the foundation for civilized behavior. So again, it's a model where good behavior is in spite of our nature. But so what Christakis says is, again, I'm tempted to say, since we are a social animal, our instincts have evolved as adaptations to a social environment as well as a natural environment. And those qualities which contribute to a social environment that supports social survival, and thus the survival of the members of that society, have an evolutionary advantage. That is to say, they are adaptive, meaning useful, meaning contributing to the chances of survival. And then he describes what he calls a social suite, which is his way of listing. There's other people listed in different ways, but this is his particular list of pro-social behaviors. And I'll just say them here. One is a capacity to have and recognize individual identities. And based on that, two is the ability to make attachments to individuals. So to have love for partners and love for offspring. Three is the larger extension of that, which is friendships. Four is social networks. We have an instinctual structure to support social networks. Five is cooperation. Six is attachment to the group. Seven is, he calls it mild hierarchy or relative egalitarianism. But what he's talking about is the ability to provide and follow leadership and to create social structure and have social rules. And eight is social learning and teaching. which is to say, to create culture and to create cumulative culture, which is why I don't have to invent a refrigerator in order to keep my things cold. If you think about how much of what we know, we've as individuals have had to learn ourselves or figure out ourselves compared to what we've been given of accumulated cultural knowledge. It's very little. Now, there is an Achilles heel, as you probably have noticed, to this pro-social suite, and that is the us versus them. And so I think the challenge we're facing now is, can we apply these pro-social qualities? Can we grow them to match the reach of our current and ever-growing powers, of the reach of our actions to shape the world? Now that our actions have such an effect on the world, can we make our pro-social instincts apply to the reach, appropriate to the reach of our powers? So if we were only in a tribe and we were maybe fighting a neighboring tribe, maybe that was one thing. But now that we are able to blow up the world with a button, can we apply our pro-social instincts to the whole world, to everyone who can be reached by our powers? So I think that's where we are, and that's the test. And we will see. I mean, we won't see, but nature will see, the world will see. But here's some things that give hope. One is, this all things we've, well, this one we're sure we've talked about, that what genetic potentials are expressed are based on the culture. So evolutionary culture affects, and evolutionary learning affects how our genetic potential gets expressed. And we've talked about, for instance, that we have both an alarm system, which is about survival and the aggression that might be needed to survive, and an affiliative system is about creating bonds and connections and weaving ourselves in, and cooperation and essentially love. And how a particular culture is built and how much it keeps us in alarm and how much it gives us a sense of belonging and connection has a lot to do with how our instincts, which of our set of instincts get expressed, as we talked about when we talked about the different parts of the brain. And also in there is that, which is why authoritarian systems, and I always think of Goebbels here, intentionally keep people in a state of alarm, because that allows people to be divided, and that prevents people from coming together against the interests of entrenched power. So what genetic potentials are expressed depends on culture. That's one. Two, culture evolves, and that has to do, when we talked about the culture, that's where cultural learning comes in, and when we talked about the structures of paradigms, where paradigms give birth to a new way of living, and then eventually get old and need to be transcended at the point when the blind spots of that paradigm are no longer affordable. And at that point, the seeds of the seeds that will give birth to the new paradigm, which have been growing and hatching within the interstices and blind spots and unfulfilled promises of the present paradigm, give birth to something new. So we would need the birth of major cultural change, would be the birth of a new paradigm. If that could come out of the ways in which it's become obvious that the current paradigm is not sustainable, you can pull that off. And again, so 3, culture feeds back to genetic potential. And that's even true, even to genetic potential, much less to what genes get promoted for the reasons we talked about. But it even looks like the ways genes are expressed, how the environment affects the way genes are expressed, even that seems to be, as we're starting to see, seems to be passed on, thus breaking through the old faith that environmental experience does not feed back to the genetic foundation. And a big word here, we got these 3 big words, right? We got what was it? Atomism. What's the other word? Holism, but the word was oh my God. Anyway, we're a whole has qualities that aren't part of the part. So so here's another big word, is exaptation. Exaptation is also an antidote to atomism. And that is basically the fact that genetic potential can be repurposed. Genetic potential can be repurposed. In fact, it's always repurposed, because evolution always starts from and uses what is. Always starts from and uses what is. This is on the genetic level, much less the cultural level. Uses it as the building blocks that it's been given to deal with the challenges of the present. So in the present, the genetic potentials that everything has been given are the foundation for how the being deals with the present. And there are many examples of this, but I'll just name 2 important ones that he talks of, that Christakis talks about. One is oxytocin. So oxytocin is an enzyme that's released at birth, and it's an enzyme of love and connection and bonding and pleasure. And it's released at birth and at breastfeeding, human giving birth and human breastfeeding, and is the foundation for a bond with the child. And that evolved into being a foundation for a bond, pair bonding in some species. And that evolved to that same thing to be repurposed for bonding in a community, for creating social bonds. Another example of that is bird feathers. It's believed that bird feathers, by our dinosaur era birds, pre-birds, the feathers were originally evolved for warmth. And that it's from having feathers for warmth, that feathers evolved to be useful for flight. And as an analogy, kind of, in terms of whether we can make this change in the development of a human child. So like the development of a human child, which starts with sort of a primal unity, right? And I think that, as we talked about, I think that the idea of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, it represents both our sense of no longer being in the state and our nostalgia for the state of being in primal unity with the world and everything. And then there's a gradual differentiation. So for instance, at 3 years old, that's the process where the child, it's called checking in child development. The child is held by the caregiver And then the child wanders off and goes, oh, that's cool. Ooh. And then at some point it goes like, ooh, what am I doing way out here? Looks back and runs back and gets re-nourished, recharged. And then goes a little further and is affected by whether the mother or caregiver looks worried or looks not worried that they're doing what they're doing. But so that's the process of checking in and recharging. And then there's a teenage stage where it's basically all about differentiation. I'm not my parents. I don't believe any of that stuff. I'm me. I'm separate. This is what makes me me. I'm something that's never been here before. And so powerful differentiation and establishing of a selfhood, somewhat, at least in part, in rebellion against against one's roots. And then at maturity, there's something like learning to become responsible for one's actions and accountable for one's actions and for the effect of one's actions and accountable to a whole or some greater good. So that would be, so on that analogy, can we as a species and as a culture, make an evolution from essentially adolescent differentiation to responsible participation and citizenship of life and reality. Stop being rageful teenagers. So can we adapt the pro-social, nurturing, bonding, affiliating, cooperating, loving, genetic and cultural qualities that have been gifted to us by our biological and cultural evolution, to our current world and to the reach of our current powers to change the world and to affect the world? Can we do that to find a new way of belonging in the world, where belonging is both being our best selves, our deepest selves, and being good citizens of the whole, good citizens of nature or creation or whatever you want to call it? And can we give this our best shot, knowing that we will never know the results, because the results do not belong to us, they belong to nature. And that's basically what I want to say right now.